This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by the Virginia Education Association. An investment in teachers today will pay dividends tomorrow. Dignity Memorial. The Dignity Network provides professional and compassionate funeral, memorial, cremation, and cemetery services throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association for jobs, the economy, and public health, committed to advancing health and economic opportunity for all Virginians. Virginia Tourism Corporation, promoting why Virginia is for lovers, lovers of wine and craft beers, the outdoors, beaches, history, music, and more. Fall in love with Virginia at virginia.org. Additional support provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a very special welcome back to the capital of Virginia to Senator Mark Warner, governor back in the early 2000s.
2002, 2006, David.
And now in second term in the U.S. Senate. Appreciate your being here. There's so much airtime that's taken up about what's happening with the president, what's happening in his administration, but what we want to do is to get you to talk some about the things that you're doing for Virginia. And why don't you start with talking about military housing, because I know that's been a big issue that you've been concerned about and working on.
Well, thanks for the question. And maybe let me just set the stage a little bit, how we got into this problem. Back in the late 90s, there was a decision made that probably sounded like a good idea at that moment in time to take all of the military housing and basically contract it out to 8 private contractors, give each of those contractors a 50-year lease. 50-year lease. And whoever cut that deal didn't do that great a job. And we found that some of these contractors have not done a very good job of maintaining the quality of the housing for our young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And what we found is this issue, as it's reemerged in the last year plus, wasn't the first time. Back in 2011 and 12, at that point, what was called Lincoln Military Housing Facilities down in Norfolk, there was a series of, particularly sailors, families, where oftentimes the sailor's spouse would be deployed, and the family spouse, often alone, was left in a facility with mold and just really crummy living conditions. Well, back in that time frame, we got the private contractor in, they fixed the problems for a little while, and the problem went away for a couple years. But as in the case of when you give a 50-year contract and you don't have a renewal clause, the contractors got sloppy again. And candidly, the military chain of command did not do a very good job of monitoring the contractors. So starting a little over a year ago, we started hearing complaints again about military families, not just in Norfolk. We saw them at Fort Eustis. I was just recently in April down at Fort Lee, and the stories were horrific. Homes with mold, homes with rodents, not being willing to be fixed. Sometimes children of some of these families getting horribly sick with asthma and other illnesses. And they weren't getting any recourse. So I said, this is not fair, this is not right, this is not how we ought to treat our military and their loved ones. Everybody loves to say they support the military, but if you don't treat their families well, then these men and women who are serving our country aren't able to do their jobs. So we hauled the same group of private contractors back in, the military chain of command. Everybody promised that they would do better, but we felt like promises alone were not enough. So we put into the defense bill that will pass this year new requirements so that military families can withhold their payment, make sure that if they're put out of their houses, they actually get some reimbursement if they have to move out because the house is not habitable. And I think we've also put enough emphasis on the military chain of command to make sure that those who are in charge have to be responsible for the living conditions for the men and women who serve us. And I'm optimistic that we're going to see a better improved living conditions. But to tell you the truth, David, if we don't see that, and even with this legislation passing, I'm going to be back down at each of our military installations over the next few months to make sure that those promises that were made to me and these families are kept.
Well, I know they really are appreciative of your doing that, and something certainly has got to be fixed. Let's jump over to another issue, because two of the major committees that you serve on have something to do with the tariff issues. What's happening there, and what do you think is going to get resolved? And because I know there's concern about what the impact it could have on the economy.
Well, sometimes I don't feel like the president understands how tariffs work. He somehow thinks that if he puts a tariff on a foreign country, it's going to only hurt that foreign country rather than hurt Virginians and Americans. The truth is, a tariff, and sometimes you need to fight back, is actually a tax on American consumers. And I been very disappointed with, let me take in reverse order, his approach with Mexico first, where on one hand he says we need a trade agreement with Mexico. On the other hand, he threatens them with this 5% tariff. Luckily, he didn't put it in place. But the idea that he was going to force Mexico into some great deal around increased border security just isn't going to be the case. If we really want to stop the flow of particularly immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, where a lot of these young people are coming right now, we need to get in and work with those countries directly to stop the flow of people coming out of those countries. In the long run, that would save us a lot of money as opposed to simply spending all our funds on border security, or what the president wanted, a border wall that security experts say is not the right solution. So the Mexico tariff, I'm glad he didn't put it in place, but we ought to recognize border security is different than trade components, and I think the president has misused that tool. The tariffs, or the threat of a trade battle with China, is an area where I actually do agree that the status quo with China wasn't working. China, it's now been declassified, is basically stealing from America $400 to $500 billion a year of intellectual property. And their theft of our intellectual property is not just directed against America, it's directed against many nations around the world. So I think the missed opportunity that President Trump had was, yes, to come in and say, we've got to change the circumstances with China, but he should have gone about and gathered an international coalition to go to China and say, China, you're a great nation. You're going to have the world's largest economy within the next few decades. We want you to be part of this world economy, but you got to play by the rules. Right. Instead, the president went out and declared Canada, our closest ally and closest trading partner, a national security threat. And I've actually got bipartisan legislation that would curtail the president's ability to use or misuse, as the case may be, the national security issues called Section 232 as a tool to kind of whack our friends. And it's with Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, very bipartisan, and we think we may get that passed shortly. In the meantime, with China, my concern is the president is entering and continuing these trade negotiations, and we need to recognize that our trade differences with China, which are real, and China has not played totally by the rules, are different from our national security concerns. And an area where, again, I think the president is directionally right on calling on Huawei, the Chinese telecom company, right, that has enormous national security vulnerabilities. I think it's appropriate that we find ways for America and our allies not to purchase this Huawei telecom equipment, because the vulnerabilities, I can assure you, that could appear in that equipment. But when the president takes the right action on Huawei and then in the next breath says, well, I might take the restrictions off of Huawei if we cut a deal with the Chinese on trade, boy, oh boy, that would be a disaster, because we've gone to the rest of the world and say Huawei's a national security threat, and if he says no, it's just a trading chip in our trade relations with China, that will hurt us long term with our allies. It will make our communication systems less secure as we move into this next generation technology called 5G, and frankly, it will weaken our hand as we try to deal with China on an ongoing basis.
What about the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement? What's the status of that? Do you see something happening there?
David, that's a great question. And I'm not sure, because I've been pro-fair trade. I think we need to make sure that we protect our workers, but I think in the long run, particularly Virginia, actually on almost any trade analysis benefits. I know that's sometimes hard to hear in Southside Virginia communities that had furniture and textiles for a long time, but on an overall basis with the port and with Dulles, Virginia is generally a net beneficiary from trade, and even trade with Mexico and Canada. But what I'm concerned with is the president went out and cut this new deal called USMCA, which frankly is just another word for NAFTA.
Yes. Yes.
But he has not really gone out and engaged the Congress in trying to convince us to accept this deal. So I, who've been generally supportive of trade, have heard virtually nothing from the White House. There's not been, I'm on the Finance Committee that deals with this issue. We've had no hearings on it. I think generally most people in the Senate are thinking, well, if the president can't make the case to the House and can't convince particularly the majority in the House, the Democrats, to go with him, then we're never even going to get a look at this deal in a meaningful way. I do hope that we can cut a better deal on labor and environmental standards in terms of Mexico in particular. And I wish the president would have been stronger on those issues before he negotiated this deal. And I think it's clear, what it appears at least to be clear, is that unless he improves Mexico's protections around the environment and also make sure that this is fair to Mexican workers so that they are not able to be bid down and actually then hurt American workers, then I'm not sure it's going to get through the House, and I'm not sure even the Senate's going to take it up.
Let's move to another issue, and as a Virginian, you know that we have elections all the time.
Oh, you know it.
And election security is really of concern. On the local level as well, on the state level, and I'm sure in the other 49 states as well. We have a big election coming up, national election coming up, and real concern about security there. Anything you could tell that will help us relax some?
No, I'd love to give you some confidence that we're going to be safe in 2019 in Virginia and 2020 at the national level. We did do better in 2018, but what concerns me is that what the Russians did in 2016, they or the Chinese or other nations may try to have that same kind of disruption in 2020. And I would argue, let's talk about election security briefly in three ways. One, you may have remembered a while back, a week or 10 days ago, when the president indicated that he wasn't sure if a foreign government tried to intervene in our future elections, whether he felt there ought to be, he'd tell the FBI. Well, I was astonished, and truthfully, the vast majority of my Republican colleagues in the Senate were astonished as well. So I've got legislation that would simply make clear that if an agent of a foreign government offers something that is already illegal in terms of assistance, because foreign assistance in our elections is already illegal, let's make clear there's an obligation for any presidential campaign to report that to the FBI. Not unlike what we do at the airports. If you see something, say something, we ought to have at least those same basic rules about protecting our democracy. Point number one. Point number two, I do think, and this is a much broader question, the ability of Russia or other countries, again, to create fake identities on social media, on platforms like Facebook or Twitter or on YouTube, is really a powerful, powerful tool. It's happened not only in America, but it's happened in countries abroad. We see this happening in elections in Brazil, in Spain, and some of this presence in Indian elections recently. So I think we need some guardrails around these social media firms so there's not as much ability to manipulate Americans into thinking somebody's talking as an American, but it's actually some foreign person, or even in some cases what's called bots, which are computerized generated messages. We ought to have knowledge about that. On election security itself, and this is an area in Virginia, we've made progress, and I commend the Commonwealth for that progress. One of the things we knew was back in 2016, Russia broke into over 21 of our states' electoral systems. And they found that we didn't have very good protections in place. And here we are, 2019, we've gotten better, but I believe we need to pass at the federal level bipartisan legislation, and there's a bipartisan bill out there that would say if you get federal money to improve the security of your election system, you've got to make sure there's a paper ballot so that there's ability to audit after the fact, so that even if a machine was hacked into, there's a paper record afterwards. We've got to make sure that there's ability to have some monitoring of the 3 companies that control 90% of all the voter files, so that you may not have a case where they break into the voting machine, but bad guys could break into the voter file and not change the votes, but move 5,000 people from one precinct to another, and you create chaos. And we need to make sure that each of the local election systems have basic security in place. My hope and prayer is we'll be able to pass that. The challenge has been, I think it would get 85 votes on the floor of the Senate, but the White House has been, unfortunately, fighting this kind of election security legislation.
Some of the concerns that I hear in the Commonwealth are from the local election officials. And in talking with them and knowing we get a chance to talk with you, one of them said, ask our senator, what about this Homeland Security critical infrastructure designation? And is there any way that can apply, from your understanding, to local offices of election where the election's really handled? It seems like the understanding is that it would apply to our Department of Elections, which is critical.
There's not really a federal Department of Elections. So I do believe our election infrastructure is critical infrastructure because it's candidly still a vulnerable place where whomever can try to break in. And Department of Homeland Security has set up a voluntary assistance program to help local registrars, state registrars, the state board of elections. We don't have a state registrar, but local registrars and others. And in 2018, they did a better job, but it's all voluntary. So I'm not saying we need to force it. Elections are still local concerns, local driven, but we're simply saying that if you take federal money, and I think we do need additional federal funds to help improve election security, and those federal funds ought to go to that local registrar, that in a sense, the price of taking those local funds would be, you got to have that paper ballot, you've got to have an ability to audit what happened, you've got to put in at least minimum security standards. For the most part in Virginia, we've taken those steps. We've taken out the machines that didn't have that paper ballot trail, so we've stepped up. Unfortunately, there's still about a half dozen states around the country that haven't.
Well, that's important for them to catch up with the Commonwealth, with the other states. And certainly in the hopes that everyone has that there never would be some kind of a disaster that would happen on election day. I know there's some concern, whether it's just a crazed individual or something that's much larger than that. Is there something in place that would, say in a federal election, that would help if let's say a part of one state wasn't able to vote because of something happened, and maybe this has happened in the past with floods or tornadoes or hurricanes or whatever else.
Well, there are provisions to make sure that if there's a natural disaster, you can move in temporary machines, and there's cooperation from the federal, again, back to the states. The elections in our Constitution are left to the states and localities to determine. But what I worry about, David, is that we should be making it easier to vote in this country. And unfortunately, we've seen in many states, with virtually no evidence of voter fraud, we've seen enormous new requirements put in place in terms of different forms of identification and others that really disproportionately harm young people and people of color in this country from having their constitutional right to vote fully exercised. I think we need to not put those state laws in place, and frankly, it's been very, very troubling to me. We've also seen, and one of the things that I hope we'd make progress in Virginia, I think we need to do redistricting reform. I think we've gone too long where the politicians get to choose their voters rather than their voters get to choose their politicians. And a number of states have gone ahead and done independent redistricting reform. And I know there's been movement in the General Assembly. I hope we'll take the next step, this coming General Assembly, to really bring independent voting redistricting to the whole Commonwealth. At the end of the day, I think what I think is so important is it moves the power back to the general election where more voters participate, as opposed to what we have too often where a district's either safe Democrat or safe Republican, and that puts all the power in the primary and ends up driving our elected officials to the more extremes.
Most often when we have a chance to catch you on national TV, it's in your role as Vice Chair of the Committee on Intelligence. And anything that you are able to tell us that you see happening there, a lot of the attention's over in the House right now, but we know that you and the Chair have reportedly been working together very cooperatively on many issues, trying to get to the bottom of some of what's happening.
David, I'm very proud that we're the last bipartisan investigation.
Yes.
But we're actually maybe one of the few remaining bipartisan committees in the Senate or in the Congress. And what we've been trying to do, where I've been focusing my time, is I'm not trying to relitigate 2016. I think we ought to make sure we're safe in 2020. And as I said earlier, we need to make sure that it's clear that if a foreign government tries to intervene in our elections, tell the FBI, no matter what political campaign you're involved in. We ought to make sure we put election security legislation in place. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. And I do think we need some rules of the road for the Facebook, YouTubes, and Twitters, these social media platforms where we've seen continuing manipulation by not just Russians, but by other foreign governments and agents as well. We need to make sure that when we're hearing from someone that it really is an American, so we look at identity validation, we look at questions about making sure we know whether we're talking to a human being or a bot, a machine. So that's one category I've been looking at. The other has been about the emergence of China. And let me say China is a great nation, and this is my challenge and problem is not with the Chinese people. Or we know in Virginia, Chinese Americans have made enormous contributions. But President Xi, at the last 3 to 4 years in China, has greatly consolidated power. They're not playing fair. As I mentioned earlier, close to $500 billion a year of intellectual property theft. They're trying to set the standards for all of the next level of innovation. I mentioned 5G, the telecommunications standards, artificial intelligence. We've kind of all grown up in a world where virtually every innovation post-Sputnik was American or Western driven. That's all up for grabs. And one of the things Richard Burr and I and Marco Rubio, another one of my Republican partners on the committee, we're trying to make the case to American business and to American academia that we have to up our game against the challenges that China poses. And again, I'm very proud to say that's been all bipartisan.
Well, tell our viewers that we're having this conversation here on the Father's Day weekend. They're seeing the show a week later. There hasn't even been the national debate among the 20-some that are seeking the Democratic nomination, and I don't know if you're ready to make your endorsement tonight. When we're talking,
not making any endorsements at this point.
What qualities or what characteristics or what would you think that people should be looking for in the next Democratic candidate for president?
Well, I want to see someone who's got a progressive set of values. I want to see someone who's not caught in a 20th century mindset. Somebody who understands the upside and the downside of technology, somebody who understands that the face of Virginia, face of America is changing. It's much more diverse. It's white and black and Asian American and Latino American, and that America ought to be a welcoming community to all. I want to have someone that, and this is the issue that I hope to lay out for my 23 Democratic friends who are running, and for that matter, if there are folks who are challenging Mr. Trump, for them as well. Sure. As somebody who's been blessed to have done very well in our country, kind of live the American dream, I really do believe that we've got to make our free enterprise system work for more people. And listen, I did very well in our system, but modern American capitalism is not working for enough people. So I think we need a system that recognizes that most young people today and not so young people are probably going to have multiple careers during their life. So let's create a system where a portable benefit system that says no matter what kind of work you do, you get some benefits with that, and it travels with you from job to job. Let's have companies that aren't simply looking at what the next quarter will bring, but how they can create value over the long term. Our capitalism post-World War II focused on shareholders' return, but also how you could do well by your employees and your community. So I hope we do some of that.
We thank you.
I know
we
thank you, David.
Much.
Hopefully you'll have me back and I can lay out some more of these ideas.
Right. Get your endorsement later. Yes.
All right, David.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by the Virginia Education Association. An investment in teachers today will pay dividends tomorrow. Dignity Memorial. The Dignity Network provides professional and compassionate funeral, memorial, cremation, and cemetery services throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association for jobs, the economy, and public health. Virginia Tourism Corporation, promoting why Virginia is for lovers, lovers of wine and craft beers, the outdoors, beaches, history, music, and more. Fall in love with Virginia at virginia.org. Additional support provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.